Hi everyone, can you hear me clearly? It's not echoing? Okay, so I deliberately chose this piece of technology just because I want to bring to your attention, nothing to do with the session we're going to have today, how technology is so gendered. Yeah, we think it's a neutral thing. This so-called lapel mic is actually made with men in mind because you guys have lapels, which we don't, on your suits or your shirts. And it's also the unit that accompanies the supposed lapel on which your mic should go is supposed to be put into your pocket. But Indian women's clothes, by and large, don't have pockets. I don't have a pocket today, so I will be doing this session holding it in my hands all the time. And, in a course I teach at Ashoka University and a couple of other places, I teach them about gender and feminism. And earlier, when I used to get a lapel mic to speak, it would infuriate me. But now I look forward to it because it allows me to introduce the subject in a way that everyone can immediately recognize something that they haven't actually seen before. So I thought, why miss out on this audience? So I thought I would just choose to wear it, clutch this thing in my hand. In the early days in Ashoka, what used to happen was that poor technician would have to come and then he would hand me the unit and he would say, ma'am, take it from under your kurta. So I would have to stand in front of my class of 100 students, half of them guys, and take this thing under my kurta and plug it in here. And then he would feel very embarrassed that I would have to walk around because I gesture a lot. So he would say, okay, ma'am, now let me tuck it into your trousers. There are no trousers. So I'd turn around before the class, lift up my kurta, and he would tuck it into the back of my churidar. Not a nice thing. I can do it because I'm an old lady, but it can be quite embarrassing. So just, don't think of technology as neutral. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two things mainly. And I'm going to do it taking a leaf out of Surajit's book. Yesterday, he made this wonderful presentation taking us through his personal journey as an archivist and all the kind of lessons and openings that he saw along the way. So I'm going to do exactly that. In the first part of my talk, I will talk to you about my personal journey as a writer, researching and writing the histories of partition. And inadvertently, or maybe that's the wrong word, landing upon an amazing archive of oral accounts of that moment, and then completely losing the opportunity to actually preserve it in the way that it should have been preserved, out of a mix of naivety and a whole range of other things. So I'll talk to you first about that. And then in the second part, I'd like to talk to you about a much more self-conscious and deliberate process of archiving that we chose to embark upon in Zuban, the publishing house and NGO where I work, and where we began to collect material of different kinds. And that process of archiving is still very live and growing in many, many different directions. So we see the potential of it, but the growth also brings with it certain lessons, certain cautions, and certain thoughts that we really need to consider, which I'd like to talk about. And then we can see, we can have a conversation with each other about the issues to do around archiving. So first of all, with the partition work, like many Indians of my generation, and I am pretty much the first generation born after the partition of India happened, I had grown up with a history of partition in my family. I'm a Punjabi, a Sikh. Both my parents were partition refugees. Both had stories to tell about how partition had impacted their families. But there were stories by and large that I ignored and did not pay much attention to, only because we have in our families quite a disrespect of the histories that live around us. So I paid no attention to them until 1984, when I was kind of shaken out of my ignorance and complacence by what happened in Delhi in 1984 when Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, was assassinated by her two Sikh bodyguards. And the entire city turned against the Sikh population of the city in a kind of orgy of violence. We in my family had never been particularly aware or conscious of our Sikh identity. My father didn't wear a turban. The only time that we became Sikhs was when my grandmother came to visit us, and then we immediately constructed a small Gurdwara in the house and pulled out the picture of Guru Nanak and put it there so that she would think we were doing the right thing. The moment she went away, it would all be packed up and put away. But as children, we accompanied her to the Gurdwara, so we became quite familiar with the rituals of Sikhism, the langar, and all of those things. So suddenly in 1984, several things happened. The city in which I had grown up and seen as a relatively safe city, and I say safe city in the sense, of course, people will laugh at the idea of Delhi as a safe city. Yeah. But if you grow up in a sheltered middle-class environment, you don't see the seamy side of the city that much, right? So we used to negotiate the city, and also when you live in a city, you know how to negotiate the safe and unsafe spots, so that for you the experience doesn't necessarily become only one of a lack of safety. You know, so for us, Delhi was that city. We negotiated it, we went on buses, etc., all of that. Suddenly it became a place of violence. And it was so shocking to see how close beneath the surface of the city the violence lay. So we started work. When I say we, I mean a bunch of people. In Delhi at that time, a group of people came together to set up a large organization called Nagrik Ekta Manch. And that organization, in a curfew-bound city, got permission from the government to actually work with the people who had been impacted by the violence. And many of us volunteered with Nagrik Ekta Manch. I was one of the hundreds of volunteers. And we were all assigned particular tasks. So my group of 5 people or 6 people was assigned a task to work in one particular area called Shakarpur, which lies across the river, or what we call a river in Delhi, and where the Sikhs had been very, very badly impacted. So our task was to go there, check out what had happened, make sure that they had shelter, they had water, they had food, etc. And I had a specific task. Like in every group, one person was given that task. My task was to take down their testimonies, and so that we would have a record that we could actually file for compensation claims or whatever, and just to have a record of the moment. And it was when I started to write those down in the register that I had, that I started to hear people referring again and again to partition, saying, oh, this is like partition again. We never thought it would happen to us in our own country. And that is when I started to ask myself this question, that why is it that I, who had grown up in a partition-divided family, had never actually thought to explore partition or even listen to my parents' stories? And why was it that the history of partition that had been handed down to us was a history that concerned itself only with political parties and political leaders? Because if 5 days of violence had done this to people, this sense of deep betrayal, of trauma, of loss, of grief and bewilderment, really not knowing what was happening, why was it that we hadn't learned anything about this in school or college or anything? So that's what started me off on the journey of, I decided that I was going to explore partition, and I decided that I was going to explore it through exploring the history of my own family first. That was the first thing. And briefly, the history of my family is as follows, that my mother had moved to Delhi a little before partition. She and my father were going to marry, and she had moved to Delhi and was waiting for him to leave Lahore and come. When it became clear that partition was going to happen, she went back to Lahore to bring her siblings. She had 3 siblings there and her mother. And when she went back, the first time was in July of 1947. So you can imagine how close to the violence it was. The violence had already started. She brought back one brother and sister. The next time she went back to bring her other brother and her mother, the brother refused to come. He was 20 years old. He basically said, I don't believe that my country is going to change overnight. I have a home here, I have a life here, why should I go? And he kept my grandmother back. And later, he converted to Islam, and my grandmother was also made to convert. I'm saying made to convert because, unlike him, my grandmother was a fairly kattar practicing Hindu. So conversion for her must have been quite traumatic. For him, it was just something that he thought was the convenient thing to do. And he was in love with a neighboring young woman who was Muslim, and he stayed back, became Muslim. And this cut off all connections in the family. So when I decided to work on partition, the first thing I did was go to Lahore, and I went to his house. And I just turned up there one night and said, yeah, I'm your sister's daughter. I've come from across the border. And this started a series of conversations which, and if I start telling you the story, then that's the only story we'll talk about. So I won't do that. So that series of conversations then led me to many, many other stories. But in a sense, when yesterday Surajit was talking about the archives that he has put together, some of you were here, and I put a question to him about, what is the nature of building an archive? In a sense, is it a random exercise where, because valuable material comes to you, you take it and include it? Or is there a vision that guides it, which says, okay, only this kind of material or that kind of material? So for me, when I started working on partition and when I decided to interview people, the question I asked myself was, and this is eventually an archivist's question also, although at that time I didn't think of it, was that this was an event or a history that impacted 14 million people, or something like between 12 to 14 million. I mean, we can talk of that statistic that encompasses 2 million people without actually having any clarity. So large was the scale of this event, because a gap between 12 and 14 is a huge gap. But we say it like it's, between 10 and 12. So we say 12 to 14 million people. So what kind of research exercise, or what kind of scale of research exercise would one have to do justice to a history that is that vast and that complicated? Should we be looking at talking to 10,000 people, 1 million people, or what? Should it be a collective exercise, etc.? I was confronted with all these questions. One person, what is one person going to do? How do you actually choose where you will start? What do you do? So I decided that I would basically just pursue the stories. I would go where the stories took me. There would be no pattern. I would not say I'm only going to talk to refugees from Layalpur or Rawalpindi or XYZ. I would just go where the stories took me. And I think that's the best decision I ever took. So I would just, when you start to do something like this, as I'm sure that all of us who are archivists or historians know, you start to see the place which you have been in, or the people that you have known, with different eyes. So I had lived pretty much all my life in Delhi. My parents moved to Delhi when I was 10 years old. But now when I started looking for partition stories, I started to see the city with different eyes. I would be walking down and I would see people of a certain age, and I would just stop and say to them, where are you from? And I started to understand an answer that I got back, which said now or earlier, which was also a question. Yeah, now or earlier in Punjabi, hune ya piche, which alerted me to the fact that anyone who answered like that was a partition survivor, because for them, time was divided into the then and the now. So that I started to see shops which had names from what became Pakistan. So we used to go to a place to eat puris. It was called Lahoriyan di Hatti. I had never noticed it before, but when I started working on partition, I began to see this. Parts of Delhi where refugees had settled, areas that had always known, but never imagined them. There is a big old fort in Delhi called Purana Killa. Behind the walls of Purana Killa was the largest Muslim refugee camp that partition people had. People were waiting to go to Pakistan. There were lakhs and lakhs of people there. So suddenly the city became different. But anyway, this is how my work started. So story led to story led to story. And an example of some kind of stories, I was with a friend of mine who runs a women's organization. She passed away recently, but the organization survives. It's called Action India. And my friend's name was Gauri Chaudhary. And I was talking to Gauri and I was telling her, and she said, "Oh, why don't you talk to my landlord?" He came from Peshawar, and she took me downstairs to the landlord's house. And I took my tape recorder with me and I started to talk to him and record his stories. Then he said, "Oh, go to my neighbors. They had this kind of history." So I went to the neighbors. Now, it was a different time also. You could go to somebody's house, knock on the door, ask to talk to them. They would open the door to you. Today, they would think you're some kind of crook and they would not let you in. So the stories started coming one after the other. Some of the stories were very, very difficult. Some were terribly painful. And at some point, and this is the kind of, when you're archiving, when you're collecting material of painful histories, in some ways, the thing we don't think of is the emotional burden that this places on the person who's doing the collecting of the histories. And I never thought of that because I imagined myself as a neutral receiver of the stories. But actually, this was my history. This was a history I was completely entangled in. So I began to realize after a while how traumatizing it was for me, how burdened I felt by, if I would talk to 3 people in a day, which seldom happened, usually it was one person. But if I would talk to 3 people in a day, 6, 8 hours of listening to stories of grief, and then you go home completely burdened and wondering, why am I doing this, So anyway, this happened. I came across quite by chance women's histories. Now, I've cut my political teeth in the women's movement. My comrades from many women's groups are sitting here. And we had learned in the movement the importance of listening, just sitting and listening to each other, and the act of listening being the catalyst for people to share more and more stories. But here I was exploring the histories of partition as a feminist, as a woman, and I wasn't talking to women. Why? Because actually the easiest people to talk to are guys. You go to somebody's house, the men come out, they talk to you. You ask to see the women, so it's not that I wasn't talking to women, I was, but the conversations were incomplete. You never got to meet a woman alone. You were sitting there talking to her, she would be telling you her story, and child would come and say, "I want chai, I want doodh, I want this, that, and the other." The elder would come and interrupt, and she would have to do something for him. The entire family would be sitting around, and you would get truncated narratives. All of these things were happening. And that's when I actually, out of just trying to grapple with this, I happened to read an essay by 2 writers called Sharna Gluck and Daphne Patai in a book called Women's Words. And they have this essay where they talk about how when you listen to women, you have to listen in stereo. You have to listen to not only what they say, but the silences, what they don't say. You have to look at the body language, the gesture, the hesitation, all of that, in a sense, tells a story. So I learned to listen to women, and when I started doing that the equation became somehow different and much easier. So to cut a long story short, there were many things like this, many accidental, random encounters that led me two very, very interesting histories. One day I was in Delhi and I was seized with this desire. Now you laugh at this because today this would not be a problem at all, but that time it was. I just had this yen to eat a hamburger. I thought I want a hamburger, but in Delhi at that time, Surajit, you might know this, the only place you could get a hamburger was in a food stall inside Chanakya Cinema in Chanakyapuri. Today, of course, you can get it at every roadside corner. So I took an auto and I went off to Chanakyapuri to get a hamburger. And the auto was stopped at a traffic light. And a woman came up to me begging, and she was begging in Punjabi. And I was really surprised because you don't see Punjabi beggars in Delhi. You see them from UP, you may see them a little bit from Bihar, but Punjabi you don't see. So I asked her the question, where are you from? And she said, she gave me the answer, now or earlier. And I realized here is a partition person. And so we got into the auto together. We had 2 hamburgers. And then I interviewed her and took account of that. So at the end of 10 years of doing this work, and 10 years not consistently, because I had a full-time job. So I was doing it in between times when I had the time and so on. I had amassed a huge amount of material. Now, what to do with it? So I sat down and transcribed each of those interviews myself. I didn't trust anybody else with it. So I transcribed each of those interviews. Now, up until then, this is a great story. Then it starts to get a little less encouraging. I transcribed the stories. I did my book. I used some of the interviews in the book. The book was published. And then the question was, what do I do with this material? It is extremely valuable material. Where do I put it? And what do I do with it? Now, things happened, and as it happens, today that material is nowhere. And I say this because this was my failure, partly out of a lack of knowledge, partly out of naivety, partly to do with technology. And I want to mention the technology part first, because in the many conversations that we've had about archiving, we think that when we scan something and put it in a digital repository, it will survive forever. But we actually don't know anything about that. And when the shape of technology changes, and old technologies are not necessarily adaptable to the newer shapes, what happens to that material? So let me explain why I'm saying this. When I said I transcribed everything myself, I used to own a computer at that time, which was one of the first generation computers. It was first, well, not quite first generation, but first generation for people like us, who had typewriters, and then we graduated to computers. I bought it for £300 in England. It was a British machine. That was a fortune at that time. It was a machine called Amstrad. And it had a particular kind of floppy disk with which you worked, which was not like the first generation floppy disk that came, but previous to that, some very funny shape. All my transcribed notes were on those. That computer, after a very short while, became obsolete. I had all those discs which had all my interviews, so I thought, oh great, at least they're there. And then I took them along to a Nehru Place kind of guy to get them transferred to another form of technology. And he told me that he's going to charge me the equivalent of 5,000 rupees per disc. I didn't have that money. I wasn't earning anything. I was in a job, didn't pay me anything. I didn't have that money, so I didn't get it done. Those discs lay around with me for a while, and then I don't know where they've gone. I had my interviews all printed out on transcripts, but even those today, half the transcripts are there, half have disappeared. I have still the original C60 cassettes on which I recorded it. But to recover the sound of not very well recorded interviews from that, I think would be very difficult and very expensive, but I'm trying to do that. So in a sense, just through a lack of knowledge, I completely lost that really valuable archive. While the stories live on in my head, I can almost verbatim recount them, but they are not there in any tangible form, except in the way that they have been used in my book, where it's a fraction of what there was. So if today somebody was to discredit my research and say, actually, you never did this, you're lying, I would actually have no defense against it. So I just wanted to tell you this story to show how the kind of mistakes that I as a person made on this, which I think many of us who work individually might well make those kinds of mistakes because we don't realize the value of the material we have. So I'm going to switch now to talk more about the professional stuff. But before I do that, do you want to ask anything, or is there a comment that anyone would like to make before I move on to the second part? Now here is where we count to 10 to see if anyone wants to say anything. Okay, if not, okay, you did, yeah.
So you mentioned that when you spoke to the women, you couldn't really have a one-on-one with them. There were other family members, and I've read your book, and at some places you do talk about the raw, emotions that the women came up with. How did you get those when they had so many restrictions, like maybe a man in the room or the
Yeah. No, that problem was an initial problem, okay, talking to women and seeing them in family settings. But over a period of time, if you build up trust, which is what I think I managed to do, then we were able to have private or one-on-one conversations and much deeper and more intimate conversations, so that those stories that you hear are from there. And it wasn't with all women. There was a woman I talked to called Damayanti Sehgal. Damayanti and I spoke over a 2-month period. So we had many conversations, and she was alone. She lived alone. And in fact, she was in her 80s at the time when I started talking to her. And she said to me, I'll come to your house and we'll talk. And I was a bit surprised at that because, in India, we think with age, I mean, if I'm younger, she's older, I should go to her. That's what we've been trained to say. So I was going to go to her. And she said, no, I don't want to talk to you in my house. I'll come to your house. And she came, and that's how we were able to have this really long interview where she spoke very, very frankly. So some of those.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question to this. So, in my work also, I work for a feminist platform as an editor, and we have a lot of women who write, write their stories, but they come to me as anonymous. So they request anonymity when we publish them. Could you get them? I mean, did any of them agree to have their names revealed, or was it a rule that you did not, you said we will keep it anonymous?
No, there was no rule that I made to keep things anonymous. But if the woman wanted her history to be anonymized, then I had to respect that. So I left the choice with the women. Okay, anything else, or shall I move on to the next stage? Okay, I'll move on, and then we can see, because there will be some overlaps between what I've talked about now and what I'm going to mention subsequently. So, in the organization where I work, Zuban, we had for years, and I want to mention the prehistory because that's what provides the context. Zuban grew out of Kali. Kali was a feminist publishing house. In the feminist publishing house, we started to publish books and other writings by and about women. Our motivation to do that was that in the early 80s, when we started Kali, we started it in 1984, the women's movement in India was very strong and extremely dynamic. And we were working on, I say we because I was also involved in that, on any number of campaigns, but in many instances, we jumped into a campaign through an instinctive sense of knowing that there was something wrong, that there was an injustice, but we knew very little about the history, the context, the political economy of any particular issue. Why was dowry taking the form that it was? Was it only Hindu? How had it turned from what it was to something else? Was it across India, etc., etc., all of that. And I happened to be working in a publishing house at that time, so I tried to ask my really nice Bengali bosses if we could publish books about women. But nice and Bengali they might have been, but they did not see that this was anything that deserved any interest at all. So they said, women, do they write? Do they read? Are women's issues serious, etc.? So at which point I thought, okay, I will do it myself. So that was what gave rise to Kali. And then Zuban continued the tradition of Kali when the two founders, my colleague Ritu Menon and I, who set up Kali, split after 19 years of working together. Ritu set up another publishing house, I set up Zuban. But then over a period of time, Zuban morphed into being a publishing house on one side and being an NGO interested in research and documentation. And that research and documentation was very clearly documentation of the multiple histories of the women's movement in India. That was its motivation. From there, we began the process of building an archive. Although initially we were not thinking of an archive, we were just thinking of collecting stuff. But of course, you have to start thinking, what are you going to do with collecting stuff? And that's when we thought of an archive. And our first collection was something that we call Poster Women. And that was that we wanted to map a visual history of the women's movement. I spoke about this a little bit yesterday in my keynote address for this conference. And we decided that we are going to do it through its posters, because every group that had been involved in the women's movement had created amazing posters, which actually mapped both an informative and factual history of the movement. So, for example, at a time when you didn't have computers, many groups would have produced posters about the Amartya Sen analysis of missing women because women were killed before they were born, the aborting and killing of female fetuses. So you had posters like that. You had posters which looked at the environment. You had posters which addressed questions of communalism, violence, etc., etc. And we thought, okay, this ephemeral, so-called ephemeral form, which has a limited use. You do it for a campaign, you take it all over the city, you plaster it on the walls, and the campaign is happening, and then end of story. So let's see what we can find and what we can understand from these. So we started to collect these posters. We wanted this exercise to be truly collaborative. We wrote off to about 200 women's groups in India saying, we're doing this, what do you think? And we got great feedback. Everybody said, great idea, we'll pull out the posters. When it came to actually finding the posters, then everybody got possessive. Oh my God, you're taking our posters away, what will happen to them? And they were torn and tattered and folded over and not well kept, but possessiveness is a big thing. So we realized that, okay, we all may be feminists and we love each other, but we also have some bad feelings still. So we actually we signed agreements with everybody, and we reassured everyone that the originals, if they wanted them back, would be returned. So we understood at the beginning that this will not be an archive that will have only original stuff. And that was a compromise we had to make to be able to work with people. So we created that archive, and it was an amazing exercise. 161 groups participated. They held workshops. They got other groups to produce pull out their posters. They sent them to us. We collated them. We created metadata sheets, everything. And we then classified them according to a set of subjects which mapped the big campaigns in the women's movement. And then we put those up on a website, which I want to show you in a minute, which made them freely available. Anybody could download low-res version of it for educational purposes or for whatever they wanted. If they wanted a high-res version for a commercial use, we would give it to them. They would have to write to us, but we would charge them, and that money would be shared with the group to whom the poster belonged. There were very strong issues of copyright, because you know how women's posters are made. So we found a poster which was on religion, which has a woman bent over double, and she has all the religious books on her back. And so we put it up and ascribed it to the group who gave it to us, saying, this is our poster. Then we had a friend from Pakistan turn up who said, but this is my poster, actually. They just stole the image and used it. So the issues of copyright with publicly created material are very difficult to deal with. So anyway, that collection went up. Then what happened was we had a bit of money left over from that collection. We thought, what do we do with this? We're not going to return it to the funder. We got a lot of money for it, what seemed like a lot at that time, from Ford Foundation. Fortunately, Ford Foundation at that time had a woman working with them as a program officer who was in love with posters. She herself had done a book. Her name is Sumati Ramaswamy. You might have heard of her. And she had done a book on the Tamil as a language and the Tamil language movement. And she had produced a lot of posters in that book. So Sumati said, I love this idea. I'll give you money for it. And she gave us money, and we shared that money with every single group. Every group was paid for its work. Whatever materials we produced out of the poster exhibition, like we did a lot of T-shirts, we did postcards, every group got a certain number of those for themselves. Every group was credited for the posters, everything. So it was truly collaborative in that sense. And I think that is what saved us. There could have been many battles, but they weren't, because everything was open and transparent, and everyone knew how much money everyone was getting, all of that. Then we had this money left over, and we thought, okay, what will we do with it? And then we decided that actually it is so important to map the women's movement through the lives of women activists. Nobody is going to do this because nobody thinks women activists have anything to contribute. So we decided to do that, and we used our leftover money to do about initially 70 interviews in 7 states across India, where we commissioned people to do a set of 10 interviews each. And those interviews were then put up on our website, also for free access. But those are audio interviews, because at that time, the only technology available was audio. You doing a video interview is a very expensive thing. You had to use a camera, and we just didn't have that kind of money. Like, we were paying people 10,000 rupees for doing an interview. So it wasn't like it could get you even, the travel was barely paid for, but that's the kind of money that we had. Then we began to think, all of this material as we were collecting, we began to think, okay, actually, let's see how women have engaged with the visual. So we put out a call to 100 women, and we said, can you each write a 1,000-word piece on how you in your activism have engaged with the visual? So we got these 1,000-word pieces, about 40 women wrote, and then those were also put up. So in this way, the archive began to be built up. Somewhere in the middle of the exercise of collecting posters, and again, I mentioned this yesterday, we became aware of the kinds of artistic productions that rural women create, in which they put out feminist messages. So we used a little bit of money that we had to buy 1 or 2 of these, And then we went back to the funder and said, we've run out of money. Can you give us a little more? Because we've suddenly found this rural women's art. And so they gave us a little more, and we managed to purchase about 50 or 60 pieces, which I think today would count as very high art. And we put those on our website as well. And we called, I think we called that particular part of Poster Women Painting Our World. So in this way, the archive kept growing. Now, today, we have that archive, but we also have, from the other projects that we've done in Zuban, many other things which we have collected, including, for example, we focus a lot on the Northeast. So in the Northeast, we did a whole series of interviews, about 50 of them, with artists, singers, dancers, writers, and others, to try and capture a cultural history of the Northeast. And that material is now being prepared to go up on our website. But several questions have come up, which I want to mention here, because it's just difficult to know how to deal with these questions. One of them is, there's a mass of material, and it's all different kinds. Some are interviews, some are visual stuff, some are podcasts, some are articles that people have written, etc. Some are webinars that we have had. We did a whole series of webinars on ecology and food, etc. in the Northeast, and we're putting all of that stuff on. But how do you create a coherent, consistent archive whose binding theme may be women and gender, but the materials you have are quite different? And we don't really know the answer to that, because none of us is a trained archivist. That is one question. The other question is, how do you actually make this material accessible? Right now, we have the free archive, Poster Women. People can take whatever they want from there. But that is only accessible to people who can read and write, right? Is there a way that we can build other kinds of accessibility into the archives they have? Is there a way that archives can reach out to people who don't have access to the digital? These are all questions we are trying to deal with. But it's also, we are trying to deal with more systems-related questions of, how do you make this information that we have comprehensible even to ourselves? Venkat, who's standing at the back there, has put together the NCVS archive, which is an amazing archive, and we are now actually chasing him, and he's quite willing to be chased, to learn from him and to learn from people who have experience in archiving how to do this. None of our colleagues is an archivist. So now we are also trying that people who run archives if we can set up talks with them who can come and teach us how to deal with this. The other issue that we are trying to deal with is, how do you keep an archive alive? It's there. The Poster Women archive is there. Somebody or the other will use it. You have several visits at different times. People use it for research. But is that all? Or should we be actively going out, holding workshops, doing small exhibitions, engaging people? When we set up the archive, we did a series of exhibitions across India, both in art galleries and with women's groups in smaller spaces. That led to a lot of exposure outside of India. So we got invited to, I think we went to the Pompidou Center, I think we went to the Saatchi galleries, we went to the Royal Palais, we went to places in Italy, I can't even remember where. So the exhibition kept traveling and kept growing. And in order to make it travel, what we did was we created prints, high-resolution prints of the posters, and we mounted them on 6mm board, and then we just had threads, the way to hang it up with threads running through it. And finally, that exhibition was low-cost exhibition was what actually traveled, although the original exhibition was with the original posters. Then after a while, those prints that we made, and we also approach the women's groups we worked with. If any of them wanted a full set of the prints, we were happy to give them. So there's a group called Swayam in Kolkata. Swayam took 220 posters from us, translated everything into Bengali, and then used them in their work. So that exhibition, the collection has gone out a lot. But how do we keep it alive now? What do we do with it in order to engage people more? And we have now begun talking with MAP here, who are going to be doing a digital exhibition of it with some workshops around it. But really, you have to think about this, that you can't just make an archive and put it out there. And finally, then, I mean, these are just some of the issues. There are many, many others. I want to mention one other thing. 2 years ago, a group of women's groups organized a meeting in Delhi of women's groups. There's different groups in the women's movement who are interested in or have been involved in archiving. Because this need to record our histories is something that everybody is feeling now. Deepa, Lalita, you can see we are all gray-haired. We came into feminism in this country in the 70s. Even from the 70s to now, the histories of feminism have not been recorded. But each group has a set of material which is extremely valuable. I mean, the first thing I did when I saw Lalita, said, "Where is Anveshi's archive? Can I take it?" You know, so we are now like magpies, and we are now like hungry people saying, "Okay, we all have these archives." And so we thought, let's get together and let's see if we can pool our efforts together and pool our resources and perhaps create not a complete, because it can never be complete, but at least a jointly held resource which leads people to different histories of the women's movement. So there's a group in Delhi called PLD, Partners for Law and Development. They've created a fantastic archive of legal judgments and legal documents. So it's a very specific thing. There's Sappho for Equality or Kamra, which has queer archives, and so on and so forth. There are many such groups. So is there a way that we can actually bring all these things together? Now, when we tried to do that, we came across some issues which are issues for archivists, that all the material is different. Each one's material is of a different kind. Some may be documents, some may be something else. How do we actually bring it together under one system? Is there even such a system? And if there is, how do we get access to it? Then the question of who owns that material, because as I told you, when we started collecting posters, then everybody became possessive. Now the idea of linking all our archives is another idea where possessiveness will enter the picture, because everybody is at different stages in collection. So somebody's thinking, I've got lots of things, oh, this one has only 10 things, why should I partner with her, etc. That is also an issue that is going to come up. And also, how do you actually do this? Because many people feel, and I link this to, so as a publisher, when we publish, as a feminist publisher, when we started, we were the only ones. So all women who were doing books, they came to us. Then the big guns realized, actually there's a market here, these women are exploring it. So they swooped down, and then all the good feminists got the opportunity to go to the big guns, so they went to the big guns. That is, as things should be, it happens. So now that same history is being repeated in the archiving discussions among us, that should we just pool our resources? We don't know how long we'll have the resources. Or should we just house our archives inside a big university or a big institution, which at least has some permanence? And that's a perfectly legitimate question. And I don't think any of us has an answer to it. So before I close this, I just want to show you the archive that we have. If we can just open it to, Shilpi, if you just open directly onto the archive, don't open the Zuban website, just do posterwomen.org. Okay, from here also you can go, but to, or if you, yeah, just do posterwomen.org. I mean, I don't mind all of you looking at this one website and buying books, but that's not what this is about. So, yeah, so this is our Poster Women website. And I mean, you can see that it's like, it's an, old-fashioned, old kind of website. Here we have information about the poster, the actual archive. If you just click on this Poster Women archive, you will see the subjects. So you can open any of the subjects, statement of strength, environment, health, literacy, and you'll see the different posters there. So there's a whole lot like that. Now, we could actually display them much more artistically, but this was what we could afford in 2011 when we set up this website. And there are hundreds and hundreds of posters on it. And the metadata identifies each one. And then this, if you just go to Painting Our World and just open any one of these. So these are the ones, the scrolls and all of that village women make. Here you see a tiger. This scroll is not very easily visible, but I mean, this is a lovely image actually. So there are many, many things like this. And then if you go to the Women's History Archive, and then here you have interviews and memories, and you can click onto the interviews and you'll have short descriptions of each of the interviews, and those are actually available. Now, one of the issues about this, for example, is we did these interviews, the first lot that are here, in the early, in 2011, 12, 13, around that time. And the entire interview is available to anyone who wants to research it. But now, even though we have consent, we don't know if the entire interview should be up there, because there are many things there in today's context that will make that woman vulnerable. And can we actually do this? So what do you do with it? Do you go back and re-seek consent? Do you take off stuff which has been there and say we'll only let people use it for a purpose which is declared? Do you redact things out of it? These are all questions to which we don't actually have easy answers. So I think we can shut this down and just, I'm done. So if you have questions, I'm happy to listen to them. Any comments or anything, any advice? Venkat, if you have advice, you've looked at this archive before, no? So, yeah, Surya.
Actually, this is a question. It is a bit of a struggle coming from the kind of work that we are also doing. When we have all the typical intersectional domains to look at, gender, caste, class, regional identity, and one becomes, for one's own interest or whatever compels that kind of research, one becomes stronger than the other. We look at caste through women. We look at class through women. We look at language and identity through women. I don't know how to give a justification for that. Why are you giving women that primary entry point to all these other issues, which have their own independent sphere of existence and problematics and everything else, and everybody has looked at it directly also. Is there an exclusion involved over there? Is it a selective sort of lens? Is there a way out? Is there a resolution there? Because I do the same thing, wanting to look at photography through women and so on. Yeah. And that's a perpetual question.
I think there's always an exclusion, and there's bound to be. So there is exclusion and choice working simultaneously. And it is also, of course, what you're interested in, what you want to do, the starting point from where you start. So you could, I suppose, just be a collector, and anything that comes your way, becomes part of your collection. In some ways, the Internet Archive is like that. There's pretty much everything on it. So how do you act? There's a purpose of it is different, no? So therefore, that makes sense in their own logic. But for those who start archives with a very specific motivation, I think there's always an exclusion, there's always a choice, and it's the choice that you make. I have no problem about choosing to focus on women. Zero. It's what I've done all my life, and it's what I'll continue to do in what's left of my life. And I will not allow people to make me feel guilty about it. This is what I feel is important, and it comes out of my political grounding, in which I have seen this operate at so many levels in the world, that I've decided, okay, this is my way, our way of dealing with the ways in which women are marginalized. Now, within that, absolutely we will focus on caste, we will focus on disability, and our posters also have that kind of descriptor in them. But we can't do everything. So you have to make choices. And somehow, I think what's important is perhaps, like in the IFA projects, when you look at the IFA projects, I think that for each of the artists who's doing a project, it's an independent project. When you see them in their collectivity, the conversation, they're talking to each other. I was looking at those projects and I was thinking, my God, this one links up with that one links up with that, these two strengthen each other. There's so much of that synergy there. That's why this gathering where everybody comes together to talk, that also is an important thing. Anything else? Yeah.
Hi. Very insightful talk. I just have a question. So even the website that we rely on, that itself has a lifetime. As long as we pay to the server, we get the space.
Absolutely.
So I have two questions. Question one is, when you are putting so much of effort in terms of collecting, analyzing, and you have an intent to do that, how do you see the lifetime of it, this content? And when you are working on it, definitely I don't know whether you have that purpose, but generally archive has a purpose, like other people would like to take it as a base and take the work forward. So how do you keep it accessible, or how do you push it for others to know? Because internet is full of information. Just searching something, the Google itself might not point this out, that look at this. So what is your strategy to make it widely available so that people who have interest in this subject, they can take it as a base and get inspired to work it forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those. Both are great questions. And I think in talking, I touched on both of those things in some way. The permanence of, or the longevity of an archive, how do you do that? So when I, in a cavalier fashion, said, people say we'll give it to X institution or Y institution, I think that is the motivation. Like Zuban may not survive in the next, maybe we'll be gone in the next 5 or 10 years. Who knows? It all depends on resources and a whole range of other things. What will happen to this archive? So therefore, even for our own survival, it might actually be a good idea for this archive to be housed in more than one place, possibly for it to belong to an institution which has a longevity, but which also has access. Though that's a question that we have to look at. Your other question, and also when you speak about technology, that this is true, we are feeling now that this 2011 website, it really needs an upgrade. It really needs to be rethought. And therefore we've never been able to do it because we didn't have the money. But now we are. And now we are also thinking that, is there a way that this material can sync with all the other material we are collecting, so that there is a synergy and a seamlessness in the material, that it all seems to be part of a similar exploration, so that people don't see it in silos. Okay, here are the posters, here is this, here is that, but one links to the other. And there are many things that one needs to do to keep websites alive. And we are really seriously thinking on those now, that what can we do? So for example, last year or the year before, the Bangalore International Center approached us and said, would you be open to having 2 researchers work on this website? And they would need this kind of access, they would need this kind of material, etc. And we said no. We said no, not because we wanted to be possessive, although I suspect that somewhere there might have been that at the back of it, who knows. But we didn't have the human resources at that time to allocate one person in our small organization who could deal with the researchers, because somebody would need to have access to the high resolution files, the metadata files, etc., etc. How to make that open? How to make that open? What do you do with it? So today we are facing that issue also, because, for example, I mentioned that we'll be doing a digital collaboration with MAP where they'll do an exhibition. The researcher they appoint will need access to our files. How do we give an outside person access to this IP, this property, without losing control of it? So my colleague said, because we are all, we don't know, we are anadi, as they say. They said, instead of it being, we have all the material locked up on our server. They said, instead of doing that, we'll put it on Google Drive. And we'll make sure the access is restricted. And even somebody with as little technological knowledge as me, I thought, no, that's not safe, because you can share a Google Drive with somebody and even lock access, but someone can also unlock that access somehow. So I had this vision of all of this material disappearing. And then I asked myself, why am I worrying about it? Because the idea is to share it. It's true, the idea is to share it, but I think we want to share it in a protected way, because we have an obligation to the original owners, who are the women's groups that we worked with. Would they want their material to go out like this? So you have to think of all of those things. I'm not saying we have any answers. These are just questions we're looking at. Do you have another question?
Not question, I just want to add. I think, our lifetime is also having its own limit. And the content that you have collected and created, and the people you are worried about, that they are the owner of the voices, right? So even if you're giving to some institution to manage it, you can have control, or during your discussion with them, you have control to assess their intent. But beyond that, once they will have access, you don't know what they're going to do with that.
Yeah.
And you can have that assessment on a couple of people you are meeting, but you don't know as an institution what is their policy,
Exactly.
what they want to do with this. Will they become a gatekeeper for that? Will they charge people to have access to that? So whole process of checking the alignment of your intention, their intention, is very critical. Isn't it true?
It is. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I can't say that I have.
True for any archive.
Yeah. But thank you for raising it. Yeah.
Can I? Okay. Thank you for asking what you asked. It gave rise to a very burning question. It's a little more generalized, but my question is, how do we defend an archive? Who defends it for the sake of its survival and permanent existence? We now tend to defend it with the means that we have, and the means itself is a system that we are a part of. It could be in the form of copyright laws, property ownership laws, and whatnot. It could be in the ownership of the archive by the institution, right? Any which way. These are the means we have to currently defend an archive. And the means itself is a system we're a part of, and which we use to defend ourselves and our possessions against the system itself. A comparison can be made with nuclear bombs, which can be used to deter an attack, but can also cause mutual extinction. So my articulated question is how to decentralize or dematrix an archive?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And if you recall, when I talked of the 25 or 28 women's groups who came together in Delhi to talk about the process of archiving, this was exactly our question. That if our archives could be mutually held by all of us, then that would ensure not only more widespread sharing, because one group may be able to access an audience that the other can't, but also because we have been involved in the women's movement together and we have created so many things together. It sort of follows that it should be jointly held. But it not only is it difficult in technical terms, which is not something that can't be surmounted, but it is also difficult in emotional terms. And for those of us who have grown up or cut our political teeth in the women's movement, what has been really important is to recognize the emotional conflicts and to address them, but allow the time to address them. So it might take years for us to feel that in this too we can trust each other in the way that we have trusted each other in many other things. Okay? And once we do that, we might have a better way of doing this. But right now, we are right at the beginning stages. So,
Thank you.
somebody else, you had a question.
Hi, thank you. Obviously, archives are set up with intention, and that intention changes and grows over time. And when we talk about evolving archives, as well, we talk about how things are supplanted. But in your example, you did talk about sometimes having to rescind certain things. So with time, when you talk about removing things from an archive, where does that come from? And when you do remove an object or a set of objects, what happens to them?
The short answer to that is I don't know. This is a question that we are trying to grapple with. At the moment, we are only looking at it in terms of the interviews we have. For example, you might have seen that we had Sudha Bhardwaj there, right? We had an early interview with Sudha Bhardwaj. Now, Sudha's life has taken a completely different direction. Even what she said then might now be very dangerous for her. So, who takes that call? We can take that call in consultation with Sudha. She probably has even forgotten she gave this interview and that it's up there. But we can go back to her and say, look, here it is. Do you want us to keep it up there? There may be 10 other archives which are carrying material from Sudha that is much more dangerous. But that's not our responsibility in some senses. We have to do the right thing. So, but when somebody is not alive, you don't know. Because then it's not them directly that your work is impacting, but it's their memory, which for the family would be as important. But what do you do? And I actually don't have an answer to that. And it's not only like redacting stuff, taking it away. Yesterday in the keynote I was doing, I talked about this book that I have, which is a listing of names of abducted women from in Pakistan, district by district listing, 22,000 names on it. It is the kind of document that should be on our archive. But I'm still grappling with this thing, can I make it public? Can I make those women vulnerable? And I actually don't have an easy answer to that. So I don't know, but these are just the questions that we have to confront with the kinds of archives that have, at least like ours does, very solid political grounding. This is the direction in which we do want to record women's histories. And in recording women's histories, you will come across stuff that is risky for the women. What do you do with it? How do you deal with it? We'll have to figure it out.
This is not a question around archives, but more on ethics. And so let me just illustrate with an example. Like as a photographic artist, when I go to work on stories of a certain community, the community comprises men as well as women and children, elderly, all of them. But as a man, it's easier for me relatively to get access to other men. They're also they're protectors. So for me to get access to the women, and henceforth their stories becomes difficult because men are going to be the custodians. So come tell us what you need. So the stories one becomes via these men. And mostly, even though I've tried a lot to find my ways in a non-threatening manner, slowly with time and stuff, it becomes tricky. Now, as a photographer, like for one of the series that I worked on, and it's part of the book that Shilpi and Surya worked on, over the years that I spent time, slowly I started to get more and more conscious that I'm getting stories from men, but I'm not getting stories from women. I did not ask to become the storyteller for the community, to speak for them, but inadvertently that's how it's turning out to be. And so the sense of this responsibility that I need to find access, that also looms larger. So gradually I did figure out I made attempts when the women started to get familiar with me over the years that, okay, he comes back so we know him, he does this, they hear the stories. So the trust level grew and I could get access to some of them. And I could also photograph them because I needed to photograph them in a certain way, at a certain time, in a certain location, so on and so forth. My question is, would you have a set of advice for male artists, photographers, storytellers who are going into such communities? What are the ethical things that we can do to get access to the stories, but also do it in a more ethical and balanced manner?
Wow, I am not sure that I can offer any advice, or even that I should be offering any, because it's not, every situation has its own context and you have to deal with that context. I think broadly what I would say is, because you have actually talked of this as a dilemma, as an ethical dilemma, I think that what has to accompany those of us who go out seeking stories in different communities, whether our own community or others, whether our own gender or others, is the first step is to build trust. And that sometimes does not happen because of the time issue. Trust takes a long time to build, as you yourself have said, right? Very often, the interviewer is rushing in interview, rushing out. That's not a situation in which you're going to even get somebody speaking openly, whether regardless of who they are or where they're from, etc. So I think the trust building exercise is important. I think also the ways of listening are very important. And that again is something that comes over time. You learn how to listen to a person when you understand that person's speech, when you understand that person's silences, etc. So I think that is also important, and not to push the agenda that an interviewer may have of pushing that person to speak. When you have a certain power over them, they may be reluctant to speak, but there you are, you've come in from outside, etc. And you can easily kind of keep pushing the questions till they're driven to speak. And I think that is also wrong, regardless of whether you're male or female. And particularly if you're male dealing with women, then you have to watch out for that even more. So I think there are broad principles that apply to any of this. Personally, what I would, and I learned this through my partition work, is I would never go in with a set of questions. I would just go in with an ear to listen and a desire to listen and not be judgmental. So the story is theirs to tell, whatever story they choose to tell me, even if it doesn't chronologically add up, it's fine. Let it come in the way that it comes, and then you can think about it when you have that story, because you might place it on an archive in an unedited way, but if you're putting it in a book, then you might want to edit it for readability, and I think that's okay, as long as you're not kind of changing it. But I don't know if there's a general set of rules and guidelines, but it's just something that we have to carry with us in our heads. Okay, I think, are we done with the questions? Is there anyone else? No? Okay. Shilpi, Surya, anything you want to say, or should we just close the discussion here?
I'd really like to thank you for sharing your intention, your work over the years. We are speaking as students, of course, and the fact that you are also a publisher. But it is really the integrity of your method that we greatly admire. Thank you for sharing it with such openness and with such detail. It's really something that we all have borrowed from, and we thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you. That's
You did
so
it for
sweet.
our authors, and now you've done it for all of us. It's
Thank you.
really
Thank you
fantastic.
all for
Thank you.
listening so
Thank you.
patiently. Now we can all go and have chai.